Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome all of you here. It's wonderful we gather together for this presentation within our Yaqui Distinguished Lecture Series. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Father Jerry Bonapane. I'm the Vice Provost for Academics and Catholic Identity, as well as holding a faculty appointment in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. I can kind of deal with those sciences. It's physics that I will have a little bit of difficulty with. But it's so good to be here and welcoming our speaker, Dr. William E. Carroll. Speaking this title of his presentation, The Error of Beginnings and the Beginning of Errors, Creation and the Origin of the Universe. Dear friends, it's so good to host and to have events of this sort at Seton Hall. Here we do embrace the Catholic intellectual tradition, which you know is a living tradition. And a core principle of the tradition is that relationship of faith and science. So I'm sure we'll get a wonderful mix of that in the presentation today. So we are pleased to welcome Dr. Carroll on his presentation on cosmology, creation, and the origin of the universe. I think we can often forget to visit or revisit beginnings. And so Dr. Carroll will certainly take us there, and with his great insight, lead through a wonderful journey today. This event just does not happen. A lot of planning goes into it. I do want to thank Father Joseph Laracy for all that he has put into planning well ahead, communicating with Dr. Carroll, but planning this. So this event is sponsored by the Seton Hall University Society of Catholic Scientists, in collaboration with a number of other units here at the university, the Stanley Yaqui Academy for Theology and Science, the Department of Physics. We thank Dr. Jose Lopez for his great work in that department and beyond. We also thank, as a sponsor, Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, the Center for Catholic Studies, Dr. Pat Manning, who heads that wonderful center, our university core curriculum program, and our program in Catholic Studies. So it's sponsored by a number of units, again, bringing faith and culture, reason, faith and science together. So, at Seton Hall, we're in existence for a long, long time, since 1856, but the mission is so much a part of who we are, but here in 2025, we want to be more alive, each of us in the community with mission, and Dr. Carroll will help us do that. So at this time, Father Laracy will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Bonapane. It's my great honor to introduce Dr. William Carroll, our distinguished lecturer. Dr. Carroll is an intellectual historian and historian of science, recently retired after more than 20 years at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford University. He currently serves as a distinguished visiting professor in the School of Philosophy at Zhongnan University of Economics and Law in China, and I expect he'll say something about his work there, which I find fascinating, bringing the perennial insights of Thomas Aquinas to the Chinese people. Dr. Carroll writes and speaks extensively on the ways in which medieval discussions on the natural sciences, philosophy, and theology can be useful in questions arising today in biology and cosmology. Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for coming to Seton Hall and sharing the fruit of your research with us.
Thank you, Father Laracy. I apologize for not standing to give the lecture, but I might become a little dizzy. And fall over, and that would be some sort of lawsuit against Seton Hall, although Seton Hall was used to lawsuits. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm grateful for all the different organizations which sponsors this. I noticed that the Communist Party of the state of New Jersey was not listed as one of those. I have lots of relationships with the Central Committee in Beijing, because I do a lot of teaching at Peking University, Tsinghua University, Renmin University in Beijing. And the Central Committee of the Communist Party is especially alert as to what goes on at its premier universities in Beijing. So I've had meetings with the Central Committee before we organized a big workshop on Thomas Aquinas at Peking University for 50 Chinese graduate students. I had to explain to the members of the Central Committee why this was not a danger, although it was never really so explicitly that, but why indeed they ought not to worry about this. I had to give them the opportunity to have heard this information so they can report it and so forth. There's a handout. A handout is pretty important. If you don't have a handout, you should get one. Well, I don't know. They've been placed strategically throughout. You will notice furthermore, at the end of the handout, I have my email address. So if you would like a copy of what I'm saying here today, send me an email and I'll send you a copy. Also on the hand, I'm not going to use all the texts on the handout, especially not the first one and a few others which you will see. Any text which is in italics are simply my words that I will be speaking, but I thought that they're important enough that you should have a written version of them, and not just depend upon you're hearing what I say. The text of what I'm going to talk, the subject and the actual text is pretty much the same level of sophistication and concepts that I use when I lecture all over the place, but especially in China. So this is a lecture which Chinese audiences would hear, and depending on the level, the academic level of the university, it would or would not need a translation into Chinese. At the top tier universities in China, it's not necessary. Indeed, to be admitted to any Chinese university, students have to pass an English examination to be admitted, regardless of what they're studying. I'm happy. This is my first visit to Seton Hall University. My only connection prior to all of this was with Father Stanley Yaki, whom I met on any number of occasions. And I was telling Father Joe that my first time I met him, I was a visiting professor in the 1980s at St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire. And Father Yaki came to give a talk, and I was invited to interview him, to introduce him, and that was but I've met him on several other occasions. So I'm happy to be here at a university with which he is so closely associated. Okay. So the era of beginnings, the beginning of errors. What is a beginning? Huh? It's a simple word, but difficult to define, in part because it admits of many applications. Beginning is a relative term. It always points to something beyond itself. Thus, to speak of beginnings necessarily includes a reference to something or things that follow from it. Looking back to a beginning already involves some recognition of what has come after. And there are as many beginnings as there are stories we tell about ourselves, our lives, our origins, and ultimately the origin of all things, of the universe itself. Obviously, one thinks here of the opening words of the Bible, in the beginning. When Aristotle writes about beginnings, one of the things he famously says, a beginning is more than half. But when he writes about beginnings, he also reminds us that a small mistake in the beginning often expands exponentially to produce error after error. This admonition of Aristotle has a special relevance in discussions with respect to cosmological, philosophical, and theological claims about the beginning of the universe, and especially the relationship between claims in cosmology and traditional understandings of the doctrine of creation. An initial error about different senses of what it means to begin is the beginning of all sorts of errors about the relationship between the doctrine of creation and the discoveries of contemporary science. Such errors often lead to a further error, to think that advances in cosmology have eliminated the need for a creator. This conclusion that there is no creator has its beginning in a fundamental error about the various beginnings that the natural sciences, philosophy, and theology address. Well, what can cosmologists tell us about the creation of the universe? An answer to this question requires us to be clear about the explanatory domains of the natural sciences, philosophy, and theology. In such an enterprise, there is no better guide than Thomas Aquinas. Perhaps it seems strange to argue that what Thomas has to say about creation and science can speak directly to debates in our own day about the philosophical and theological implications of current cosmological speculations. Now, you might imagine, I've been to China 8 times for a month each, and always talking about Thomas Aquinas' creation and contemporary science. And my Chinese students and colleagues, professors, are fascinated with Thomas Aquinas. And in the questions, we might go into some detail about the reception of this. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to Harvard to talk about Thomas Aquinas in China and why there's such a fascination in China within academic circles with Thomas Aquinas. Well, despite dangers of falling into anachronistic commentary or of failing to recognize profound differences in the ways in which terms such as science, creation, and time have come to be used in the centuries that separate us from Thomas Aquinas, when it comes to drawing philosophical and theological conclusions about contemporary cosmology, insights from the Middle Ages remain valuable. Now, astronomers often note that to look out at the universe is to look back in time. Perhaps to look back in time to medieval discussions of creation and science will help us to look out more clearly and to avoid confusions about what we are seeing and what the implications of contemporary science are. But before looking back to Thomas, I want to provide a brief survey of some current cosmological claims. Recent developments in cosmology have been used to reach philosophical and theological conclusions about the beginning of the universe. In The Grand Design, the book The Grand Design, Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow make the point that just as the universe has no edge, so there is no boundary, no beginning to time. Therefore, to ask what happened before the beginning or even at the beginning would be meaningless. And this is quotation number 3 on your handout from The Grand Design. In the early universe, when the universe was small enough to be governed by both a general relativity and quantum theory, there were effectively 4 dimensions of space and none of time. This means that when we speak of the beginning of the universe, we are skirting the subtle issue that as we look backward toward the very early universe, time as we know it does not exist. We must accept that our usual ideas of space and time do not apply to the very early universe that is beyond our experience, but not beyond our imagination. Hawking said that nothing caused the Big Bang because there was no time at such a putative beginning. For Hawking, and indeed for most people, The relationship between cause and effect is essentially a temporal relationship. A cause always precedes temporally its effect. So when he applies this understanding of cause and effect to his cosmology that allows no time in which a creator would exist prior to what he creates, he concludes that since there is no time, and hence no causal nexus, there is no creator, because causal nexus only exists in the realm of temporality. Recent theories concerning what happened before the Big Bang, as well as those that speak of an endless series of Big Bangs, or some version of a multiverse hypothesis. They're often attractive because these theories too tend to deny a fundamental beginning to the universe and thus appear to make a creator irrelevant. There is a desire in some cosmological circles to get rid of the troubling singularity of the Big Bang itself, a singularity that seems to many to indicate a beginning to the universe. Such theories about what happened before the Big Bang allow cosmologists like Neil Torok and Paul Steinhardt to claim that the Big Bang is not the beginning of space and time, but rather an event that is in principle fully describable using physical laws. Nor does the Big Bang for Torok and Steinhardt happen only once. Instead, the universe undergoes cycles of evolution. Some cosmologists have used insights from quantum mechanics to offer accounts of the Big Bang itself. They speak of the Big Bang in terms of quantum tunneling from nothing, analogous to the way in which very small particles seem to emerge spontaneously from vacuums in laboratory experiments. Thus, these cosmologists think that to explain the Big Bang in this way, as the fluctuation of a primal vacuum, quantum tunneling from nothing, to explain the Big Bang in this way eliminates the need to have a creator and leads to the conclusion that physics itself is competent to explain the very beginning of the universe. One cosmologist, Alexander Vilenkin, argues that although he thinks the universe has a beginning, modern physics can describe the emergence of the universe as a physical process that does not require a cause. This is quotation 4 on your handout from Vilenkin. What causes the universe to pop out of nothing? No cause is needed. If you have a radioactive atom, it will decay, and quantum mechanics gives the decay probability in a given interval of time, say a minute. There is no reason why the atom decayed at this particular moment and not another. The process is completely random. No cause is needed for the quantum creation of the universe. Now, there are other thinkers who have embraced traditional Big Bang cosmology that seems to affirm an absolute beginning to the universe as providing scientific justification for, if not actual confirmation of, the Genesis account of creation. The argument here is that an initial singularity outside the categories of space and time points to a supernatural cause of the beginning of the universe. William Wayne Craig, one of the better-known proponents of this position, and this is number 5 on your handout, William Wayne Craig, one of the better-known proponents of this position, outlines his argument in a simple syllogism. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. That's Big Bang cosmology. 3, therefore the universe has a cause, it is created. Craig's argument appears to have an immediate appeal. In addition to referring to contemporary Big Bang cosmology to support the conclusion that the universe is temporally finite, that's the little outline I just gave you, Craig also invokes philosophical arguments about the impossibility of past times being infinite, an impossibility, you can't have an eternal past on the basis of You can't have an infinity of past events. An impossibility of times being infinite that leads ineluctably to the conclusion that the universe has a beginning. So in Craig and others, we have both a cosmological argument based upon a notion of causality. Whatever begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist. That's Big Bang cosmology. Therefore, it is created. And then there's this other philosophical argument about the impossibility of the past being eternal. If the past cannot be eternal, it must have a beginning. If it has a beginning, it must be cause, so forth. That's a brief summary of Craig's two arguments. In addition to whether or not cosmology discloses a beginning to the universe, there is also a more explicitly philosophical debate about whether any beginning to the universe requires a cause. With respect to the question about causality, because creation is a concept of causing of things, physicist Sean Carroll, in his book, The Big Picture on the Origins of Life, Meaning, and the Universe Itself, says, and this is quotation, go to 6 and 7 coming up from Sean Carroll, who is no relation to me. He's a very sophisticated physicist and great popularizer of contemporary science. Carroll writes, causation, a derived notion rather than a fundamental one, is best thought of as acting within individual theories that rely on the concept. The notion of cause, he says, is not the right vocabulary to use when thinking about how the universe works at a deep level. Carroll argues that the first premise in Craig's syllogism, whatever begins to exist has a cause, that premise is false. Indeed, Carroll rejects the legitimacy of asking for a cause of the universe as such. And this is long quotation number 7. Why should we expect that there are causes or explanations or a reason why in the universe which we live? It is because the physical world inside which we are embedded has two important features. There are unbreakable patterns, laws of physics. Things do not just happen, they obey laws. And there's an arrow of time stretching from the past to the future. The entropy was lower in the past and increases toward the future. Therefore, when you find some event or state of affairs B today, we can very often trace it back in time to one or a couple of possible predecessor events that we therefore call the cause of that which leads to B according to the laws of physics. Here comes the kicker in the argument. But crucially, both of these features of the universe that allow us to speak the language of cause and effects are completely absent when we talk about the universe as a whole. We do not think that our universe is part of a bigger ensemble that obeys laws. Even if it is part of the multiverse is not part of a bigger ensemble that obeys laws. Therefore, nothing gives us the right to demand some kind of external cause for the universe. Nothing gives us the right to speak of a creator. Carroll, however, here confuses one kind of causality, that between temporally separated events, A before B, with a much richer and broader sense of cause. He thinks that causality, as he says, follows from the laws of nature, when in fact it is just the opposite. Indeed, laws of nature reflect the causal relations that exist in the world, and thus these laws of nature depend upon the priority of causal relations. In rejecting the application of his restricted notion of cause to the question of the cause of the universe, Carroll mistakenly thinks that he shows the falsity of traditional arguments for a cause of existence as such, that is, ultimately arguments for an uncaused cause. So he defines cause and effect in a rather restricted way, and he takes that restricted sense of causality in terms of temporal sequence, and he applies it to the question of the cause of the universe as such, and says that it makes no sense to speak of the cause of the universe itself as such. This is because his notion of cause is a rather restricted notion, and we can talk more about this if you like. In discussions about creation and beginnings, there is a further confusion. This concerns the meaning of nothing in the expression creation out of nothing. The tendency is to think that coming to be out of nothing must refer to a beginning. A counter-argument, of course, is to say that an eternal universe, one without a beginning, cannot be created out of nothing, not only because there is no beginning, but also because for something to come to be out of nothing would violate a first principle of all science, that from nothing, nothing can come. So if you think that creation out of nothing necessarily means a beginning, and if you affirm in your cosmology an eternal universe, a universe without a beginning, obviously there's a contradiction between the notion of creation out of nothing and a notion of an eternal universe. For all the changes that the natural sciences study, any coming into existence requires something prior from which the change occurs. But just as there are confusions about beginning, so too there are confusions about nothing, as well as confusions about what coming into existence means. And if we have time, I'd be happy to show how on this very topic about what does out of nothing mean, the genius of Thomas Aquinas involved a disagreement with his teacher Albert the Great and with his colleague at the University of Paris, St. Bonaventure, both of whom thought that creation out of nothing had to mean after nothing. But we'll talk more about this in a moment. So back to confusions about nothing. One of my friends who teaches in Nova Scotia, a former student of mine, often introduces me as saying, I go about the world talking about nothing. Alexander Vilenkin, who we've already seen, who accepts a version of quantum tunneling from nothing as a description of the origin of the universe, and this is going to be number 9 on your handout, notes that the nothing in his account is, quote, a state with no classical space-time, the realm of unrestrained quantum gravity. It is a rather bizarre state, to say the least, a rather bizarre state in which all our basic notions of space, time, energy, entropy, etc. lose their meaning. Vilenkin offers the following thought experiment. Imagine space-time as the surface of a sphere, and then suppose that the sphere is shrinking like a balloon losing its air. As the radius grows smaller, it eventually goes to 0. The surface of the sphere disappears, and with it, space-time itself. We have arrived at nothingness. We have also arrived at a precise definition of nothingness, a closed space-time of 0 radius. This is the most complete and utter nothingness that scientific concepts can capture. It is mathematically devoid not only of stuff, but also of location and duration. However, the nothing in some cosmological models that speak of the Big Bang in terms of quantum tunneling from nothing, that nothing is not the nothing referred to in the traditional sense of creation out of nothing. The nothing in these contemporary cosmological reflections may very well be nothing like our present universe, but that nothing is not the absolute nothing central to what it means to create. The nothing of Vilenkin is only that about which the theories say nothing. And we'll be talking more about this coming up with Aquinas. Despite a widespread interest in nothing, the nothing to which many authors refer is really something, even at times a quasi-ambiguous reality. But the nothing in the traditional understanding of creation out of nothing only refers to the absence of everything other than God. Indeed, in a way, to speak of other than God risks the danger of locating God and things on the same metaphysical plane, perhaps differing only in degree. Nor ought we to think that creation out of nothing means that there are two realities, two ultimate principles, God and nothing. As we shall see, creation out of nothing does not mean that God changes nothing into something. Rather, creation out of nothing is a way of affirming that it is God alone and nothing else who is the cause of absolutely everything that is. Now, what I've been saying so far is that, in a way, the current debate about cosmology and creation is primarily about whether or not cosmology discloses a beginning of the universe. Hawking, for example, denies the intelligibility of such a notion of beginning. Others argue for variations of an eternal universe. William Wayne Craig and others claim that current cosmology does indeed point to a beginning. The debate framed in such terms about a beginning lead the exponents either to reject or to embrace the idea of creation. So despite fundamental differences as to what contemporary cosmology tells us, and there are such big differences, all these views, pro and con with creation, all these views tend to identify what it means for the universe to be created with the universe as having a temporal beginning. This emphasis on beginning leads to confusions about creation. The error here is to think that creation necessarily means, I emphasize that adverb, necessarily means that the universe has a temporal beginning. You see, if creation and beginning are connected in this way, it becomes easy to see how a denial of there being a beginning leads to a denial of creation, and that an affirmation of a scientific account of a beginning, or even the rejection of a beginning, leads to an affirmation of creation. That an affirmation of a scientific account of beginning, Big Bang understood by Craig, leads to an affirmation of creation. Again, my point is that confusions concerning creation and cosmology run the gamut from denials of creation because the universe is conceived as having no beginning, to explanation of a beginning in exclusively scientific terms that avoid any appeal to a creator, to denying the intelligibility of asking questions about the cause of the universe itself, to opposing claims that the Big Bang offers a kind of scientific warrant for belief in God's creation of the universe. All of these theories, both in favor of and opposed to the idea of creation, share what I've called the error of beginnings. But if creation ought not to be identified necessarily with the beginning of the universe, what then does creation mean? So contrary, and this is going to be number 11 on your handout in italics because these are my words, contrary to all these claims that use cosmology either to deny or to affirm creation, we need to recognize that creation is a metaphysical and theological affirmation that all that is, in whatever way or ways it is, depends upon God as cause. The natural sciences, including cosmology, have as their subject the world of changing things, from subatomic particles to acorns to galaxies. Whenever there is a change, there must be something that changes. Whether these changes are biological or cosmological, Without beginning or end or temporally finite, they remain processes. The scientific principle that from nothing, nothing comes is true, but it is a truth with respect to changes that occur within the world. Creation, on the other hand, is the radical causing of the whole existence of whatever exists. Creation is not a change. To cause completely something to exist is not to produce a change in something, is not to work on or with some existing material. At the very least, this is the traditional understanding of creation. The phrase, creation is not a change, I think I'm going to mention a little bit later. Thomas puts in Latin, creatio non est mutatio. Creation is not a change. And I have my Chinese students memorize that Latin phrase because I tell them I want them to utter, sotto voce perhaps, on the subways, the buses, the streets of China, creatio non est mutatio, because I hope that eventually 1,400,000,000 Chinese, including President Xi, will say creatio non est mutatio. It's a key to understanding this. So we continue here in the second paragraph in number 11. Cosmology and all the other natural sciences offer accounts of change. They do not address the metaphysical and theological questions of creation. They do not speak to why there is something rather than nothing. It is a mistake to use arguments in the natural sciences to deny creation. It is also a mistake to appeal to cosmology as a confirmation of creation. Discussions of creation are different from arguments from order and design to a source of order and design. Similarly, discussions about the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe do not directly concern the topic of creation. Thus, whether or not multiverse theories do away with the need to explain such fine-tuning, they do not provide a commentary on creation. Creation, however, offers an explanation of why things exist at all. It may very well be that that natural philosophy, working with the discoveries of the empirical sciences, can lead us to knowledge of the existence of God. But this would not yet be knowledge of God as creator. For this type of knowledge, we need metaphysics and ultimately revelation. Now, my analysis thus far has been heavily influenced by the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but now I'll be a little more precise in my reference to him. Already in the 13th century, the groundwork was set for the fundamental understanding of creation and its relationship to the natural sciences. Working within the context of Aristotelian science and aided by the insights of Muslim and Jewish thinkers as well as his Christian predecessors, Thomas Aquinas provided an analysis of creation and science which remains true. One of the key texts from Thomas is from his treatise on separate substances, this is number 12 on your handout, where he writes, over and above the mode of becoming by which something comes to be through change or motion, there must be a mode of becoming or origin of things without any mutation or motion, through the influx of being. For Thomas, creation in its fundamental sense means a dependence in being, which is a notion in metaphysics, not in the natural sciences. To be caused to be by God means to be dependent upon God for the fact that one is. The relationship here between divine cause and created effect is one of metaphysical dependence. Indeed, the fundamental sense of causality involves dependence and not any temporal relationship of prior and posterior. Notice that in this quotation number 12, that Thomas distinguishes between the mode of becoming by which something comes to be through change or motion, from the more fundamental sense of creation that he identifies as the influx of being. The latter, the influxes of being, is the causing of existence as such. That little phrase, as such, is important. It helps us to recognize the difference between causing something to come to be or to exist in the ways in which, for example, animals produce offspring and so forth, or human beings cause pencils to exist in factories. Between that and God's causing of the actuality of whatever is as it is, the causing of existence as such. Were God not causing everything which exists as such to exist, there would be nothing at all. So everything that is, in whatever way it is caused to be by God or to be nothing. The ideas in your head or that exist right now are caused to exist by God or they would be nothing. Now, they're caused to be your ideas, but they still require God as cause. The coolness of the evening breeze exists. That coolness is caused by God, else it would not exist at all. Every choice you make is caused to be the choice you make by God, or it would not exist at all. God causes everything to exist in whatever way or ways it exists. Thomas's philosophical analysis of the complete dependence of all existing things, precisely as existing, his analysis occurs in the discipline of metaphysics and involves a profound understanding of the difference between what a thing is and the very existence of a thing and the existence of all of its features. Thomas argues that no existing thing can be the fundamental cause of its own existence. Causing of existence in this fundamental sense is what creation is. And as I've said, as Thomas often notes, creatio non est mutatio. Creation is not a change. The doctrine of creation tells us why there is something rather than nothing, and this topic is in a category beyond the explanatory domains of the natural sciences. Now, in quotation number 13, I have a passage from creatio non est mutatio for you. Now, number 14. When speaking about the origin of the universe, understood as God's causing it to come into existence, Thomas Aquinas observes that there are two complementary senses of creation out of nothing, one philosophical, the other theological. The philosophical sense means that God, with no material cause, makes all things to exist as beings that are radically different from himself and completely dependent upon his causality. This philosophical sense of creation has two essential elements. One, there is no material cause in creation, no stuff whatsoever out of which God makes the world. And two, the creature is completely dependent throughout its entire duration upon the constant causality of God. This philosophical sense of creation is the sense in which creation out of nothing is a subject in metaphysics, concerning the complete dependence of all that is on a cause of existence. And as Thomas notes in several places, in the most radical sentence written in the 13th century, not only does faith hold that there is creation, reason also demonstrates it. Not only does faith hold that there's creation, reason also demonstrates it. One of my first lectures in 2013 at Fudan University, I quoted this. And I said, well, you know, this sentence of Thomas was one of the more radical claims in Western intellectual history. And I said, you know, it's true not only in 13th century Paris, but right here in 21st century Shanghai. And the students smiled, the professors looked apoplectic about that, but it was quite something, the reaction. This demonstration of creation to which he refers, the demonstration on metaphysics, And one of the more famous of his demonstrations begins with the distinction between the existence and essence of things. For example, what it means to be any creature, the essence does not include the existence of the creature. And this argument ultimately concludes with the necessity of there being a reality God for whom or in whom this distinction between essence and existence disappears. I've included in the handout a brief passage from this is number 15, from Thomas's treatise on being and essence, which contains a summary of this metaphysical argument for creation. So, creation is not primarily some distant event. Rather, it is the ongoing, complete causing of the existence of all that is. As I said a moment ago, at this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns first of all the origin of the universe, not the universe's temporal beginning. Indeed, it's important to recognize this distinction between origin and beginning. The former, origin here, affirms the complete continuing dependence of all that is on God as cause. Whatever is created has its origin in God. But we ought not to think that to created must mean that whatever is created has a temporal beginning. It may very well be that the universe had a temporal beginning, as the traditional interpretation of the opening of Genesis acknowledges. But there is no contradiction in the notion of an eternal created universe. For were the universe to be without a beginning, it still would have an origin. It still would be created. As we've seen already in Stephen Hawking's denial of God's causing the universe to be because there is no time, hence no temporal priority, hence no causality to be exercised. Cause and effect for him are often seen as necessarily involving a temporal sequence. But Thomas can speak of an eternal universe being caused by God because he does not limit the relationship between cause and effect to a temporal sequence. And of course, he distinguishes between God's causality and the causality which creatures exercise. God's causality as creator is prior to the created effect, but the priority is not a temporal one. It's the failure to recognize that to be created does not necessarily entail a temporal beginning that causes considerable confusion in contemporary debates about the implications of cosmology for arguments about whether or not the universe is created. This error about beginnings continues to be the beginning of all sorts of errors about what cosmology can properly describe and what creation is. Thomas Aquinas thought that neither science nor philosophy could know whether the universe had a beginning. He did think, as I've suggested, that metaphysics could show that the universe is created. A world with a temporal beginning concerns the kind of world God has created. It may very well be easier to accept that a world which has an absolute beginning is a created world, and such a world may be especially appropriate for understanding sacred history, important as that is for believers. But an eternal world, one without a beginning to time, would be no less a created world. Thomas, of course, believed that the universe had a temporal beginning. This was the common view of the Church Fathers and solemnly proclaimed as church dogma at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Thomas recognized that what was given in faith, that the universe had a temporal beginning, completed and perfected what reason could know about creation. After all, reason itself in metaphysics accounted for creation without any reference to temporality. Now, there's much more to be said about the theology of creation, but as you see in my remarks today, I've been emphasizing Thomas's philosophical analysis. Thomas would have warned against those today who use Big Bang cosmology, for example, to conclude that the universe has a beginning and therefore must be created. He was always alert to reject the use of bad arguments in support of what is believed. Quotation 16 on your handout. He writes that the world had a beginning is an object of faith, but not a demonstration or science. And we do well to keep this in mind. Otherwise, if we presumptuously undertake to demonstrate what is of faith, we may introduce arguments that are not strictly conclusive, and this would furnish infidels with an occasion for scoffing, as they would think that we assent to truths of faith on such grounds. So, the singularity in traditional Big Bang cosmology may represent the beginning of the universe we observe, but we cannot conclude that it is the absolute beginning, that kind of beginning which would indicate creation. As we've seen, some contemporary cosmologists are interested in what happened before the Big Bang. So in conclusion, and this is number 17 on your handout, cosmological theories are easily used, or rather misused, to support or deny creation. Each time, however, as I've suggested, to create has been joined inextricably to temporal finitude, such that to be created necessarily means to begin to be. Thus, to deny a beginning is to deny creation. It was the genius of Thomas Aquinas to distinguish between creation understood philosophically, with no reference to temporality, and creation understood theologically, which included the recognition that the universe does have an absolute temporal beginning. There is, finally, a wider confusion at work here, wider than the confusing of creation with beginnings. It is the failure to distinguish between creation and changes that occur within the created order, and hence the failure to recognize that the natural sciences, including cosmology, have nothing to tell us about the ultimate cause of the existence of things. God's creative power is exercised throughout the entire course of cosmic history in whatever ways that history has unfolded. No explanation of cosmological or biological change, no matter how radically random or contingent such explanations claim to be, challenges no such account, challenges the metaphysical account of creation, that is the dependence of the existence of all things upon God as cause. When some thinkers deny creation on the basis of theories in the natural sciences, or use cosmology to confirm creation, or reject the conclusions of science in defense of creation, they misunderstand creation or the natural sciences, or both. We need to avoid the error of thinking that discussions in the natural sciences about beginnings have anything at all to tell us about the creation of the universe. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to answer some questions. Or
Thank you very much. Summarize the questions for those who are listening by video.
Oh, okay. By video, okay. Because you're going to put it up to me to summarize the question. The question is, with my Chinese academic audiences, how do we handle this notion of talking about creation in metaphysics and God as subsistent being and so forth, which are alien notions, unless they've studied. Big departments of philosophy at universities like Peking or Wuhan or Renmin are divided. They have a Department of Philosophy, Department of Marxist Philosophy, and Department of Foreign Philosophy. Right? And they do study texts of Thomas Aquinas. One of the problems I have to overcome in the Chinese intellectual and cultural traditions are temporally more ancient than those of the West, and in some ways richer, especially in areas of ethics. And the initial contacts philosophically between East and West have been in those areas of ethics, not so much in China of a development of metaphysical reflection or on fundamental conceptions of causality, which is connected to metaphysics. So one of my tasks is to say we're entering alien territory to talk about metaphysics here. And I have to spend some time talking to them about what it means to discuss existence or being. And some of the problems are there Chinese words which can easily be used to translate these terms? And that's already a problem. When the Jesuit missionaries, Matteo Ricci and others in the 17th century, 16th and 17th, came to China, they wrestled mightily with how to translate notions of creation into the Chinese language when they wrote catechisms, and they wrote many, many, many texts on these matters. So I remember talking early on at Peking University with a professor of philosophy there about this notion of causality, because that's really the key. I mean, it's discussed in metaphysics, but it's a key notion to talk about. And I said to him once, why is it that in Chinese intellectual traditions, there's not much reflection on causality? It's more a reflection on sort of confluence of events, not causal connections. So we looked at him and said, why are you people in the West so fascinated with the notion of cause? So there is a huge, and in fact, in contemporary, not only contemporary, but especially in contemporary Chinese intellectual circles, there are views of people who would say that, well, the Chinese intellectual tradition and systems of thought, that's over here, the Western traditions are over here, and there is really no way for one to speak to the other, finally, because we don't share common foundations. Now that's I know it's a minority view, but it's certainly not the only view. There are lots of work being done on trying to find comparisons here. What is interesting is as Chinese scholars are fascinated with the encounter between the Jesuits and the intellectual elite of China in the 16th and 17th centuries, and want to understand better that encounter, they come across arguments about creation, about the immortality of the soul, which the Jesuits put. And that leads them, my contemporary scholars, in trying to understand the 17th century encounter, that leads them back to the thought of Thomas Aquinas, because the Jesuits, in their Ratio Studiorum, Thomas Aquinas is the teacher. So all the Jesuits who go to China, well, not only to China, but to Japan, Southeast Asia, and so forth, are trained in Coimbra, in Portugal, before they go. And they are reproducing commentaries written by Jesuits in Portugal, commentaries on Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. They're translating them into Chinese. So to understand better the encounter between West and East in the 17th century, contemporary Chinese scholars, philosophers, are more and more interested in Thomas Aquinas. I'll tell you one anecdote. In 2014, Wuhan University, which has a Thomas Aquinas Studies Center and has translated On Being and Essence, On Truth, and more recently the Summa Theologiae, had a conference on the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And I was one of the 3 people from the West invited, and all the rest were scholars from Chinese universities who spoke on the Imago Dei in Thomas Aquinas, who spoke on Thomas Aquinas and biblical hermeneutics. The dean of the Faculty of Philosophy of Wuhan University welcomed us, speaking in Chinese, but we had the English text. And he said, this was 2015, you know, we in China for too long have suffered from a bias. We have thought that anyone who was fundamentally religious could tell us nothing of any importance about philosophy. As a result of this bias, we have been cut off from some of the great thinkers of the West, such as Thomas Aquinas. It's time for us to overcome this bias. Sitting next to me was Father Michael Sherwin, famous Dominican. He was then a professor at Fribourg University, and he's now at the Angelicum in Rome. He leaned over to me and said, "Bill, could you imagine the dean of a philosophy faculty of a Western university making such an admission?" And it was, there is a national forum for the study of medieval philosophy in China. And they hold annual meetings. We've had about 7 so far. Last year at Huazhong University of Science and Technology in Wuhan, they had a meeting all dedicated to the 800th anniversary of the birth of Thomas Aquinas. All the talks, 70 professors from different Chinese universities came to talk about Thomas Aquinas. And so there is a fascination. Part of the fascination is connected, I mean, it's sort of alien, but he's often referred Thomas the great sage of the West. If you read the journal First Things, in the most August issue, Father Thomas Joseph White, the rector of the Angelicum, wrote a piece, it was based upon a lecture he gave in New York on the future of Catholic theology. And he began by talking about his experience. I organized a workshop in China on the thought of Thomas, and I had of Aquinas. I had Father White come to speak about metaphysics. So the first couple of paragraphs in this essay in First Things of, I guess it's August issue or the August-September issue, Father White talks about his experience asking Chinese students that he met while he was in Wuhan, why is it that they're fascinated with Thomas Aquinas? So Thomas Joseph White is pretty good on almost everything he writes. So this would be, if you'd like to see an example of that. So, long way around. The biggest barrier is the absence of a strong metaphysical tradition, and one has to learn the language of metaphysics. One has to know that there's such a discipline. Because metaphysics doesn't, no academic discipline proves itself. You have to argue dialectically to get them to see. In other words, you can't prove that there's a discipline of geometry. You can't prove that there are lines and points and planes and so forth. The first principles of any discipline are not demonstrated in the discipline, including the very existence of the discipline. So you have to argue, if someone denies that there are lines, points, and planes, for example, or that there are living things, for example, you can't prove it. You have to argue dialectically to get people to see, aha, there really are such things as lines, points, and planes. There really is a discipline studying continuous magnitude, geometry. Analogously, I have to argue dialectically with my well, not only in China, but certainly here in the West as well, to get them to see that there really is a discipline of metaphysics and it really has first principles and so forth. And that dialectical arguments are the only way to get at it. So it's a long way around, but... God didn't how can I prove that God created himself? I can't, because God doesn't create himself. God is not self-caused, right? God is the cause of all other causes. God is the uncaused cause. So to speak of God is not to speak of some reality which creates himself. Everything which exists in our world is caused to be by God. In an important sense, God doesn't exist. God is. Existence is a characteristic. Now, it's not wrong to say God exists, but if you reflect more on it, existence is a characteristic of things. I'll give another Chinese example. One of my students from Peking University is a graduate of probably one of the most famous high schools in China. It's called Shanghai High School. And he arranged for me to give a lecture there on metaphysics, cosmology, and the origin of the universe. And we had the text in English and the text in Chinese, and there were 800 high school students on this subject. And I looked out and I said, I think I'm looking at the future of China. Or people who do very well on standardized tests. But anyway, it was really about cosmology and creation, similar to this lecture in very way. And there were 40 minutes of questions. These high school kids. First question, a young woman, probably 18 or 19. Who caused the uncaused cause? Which is analogous to your question. And I said, well, this is not an unusual question. I didn't want to say it was not so unusual. I said, look, if there really is an uncaused cause, to ask what is the cause is not to understand what it means to be an uncaused cause. Now, maybe there is no uncaused cause, but if there is an uncaused cause, then to ask what is the cause of it, you're not talking about the uncaused cause. Right? So, I can't prove to you that God doesn't cause himself. I only can say that to talk about God's causing himself is a contradiction, because what we mean by God is the uncaused cause of all that is. Right? And therefore, what causes God is not to be speaking properly about either cause or God. One more example from this audience of 800 kids in Shanghai High School. The second question, young man, 19, but final year, he asked, how can creatures with finite minds understand an infinite reality? I couldn't believe the question. It's one of the most profound questions to be raised in the West. And here is this 18-year-old. He's only studied Marxist philosophy. Every year they have to have courses in Marxist philosophy. And he asked that question. So I complimented him. I said, that's a wonderful question. So I again began to talk about the limitations of our knowledge of God, of infinite. But it's an example of the kind of, well, again, it was an unusual question. So back to your question about the cause of God. To ask what we're not talking about God or really of cause if we ask what causes God. Now this requires, to show it, if I say a square circle is a contradiction, how do we know that? I have to explain what square is, I have to explain what circle is, and then don't you see, square circle is just noise, it doesn't refer to anything. So, who causes God? I'd have to proceed analogously. What do we mean by cause? What do we mean by God? To show that what causes God is like what is a square circle. Right? But, of course, what is a square circle is an easy thing to understand the contradiction. What causes God is a not-so-easy question. Yeah?
Dr. Carroll, you made reference to Father Stanley Yaki, who taught physics here from 1999. Christian creation, which provided a unique impetus to the development of natural science, emphasizing a contingent. Could you give your take on his thesis about the impact of that doctrine, the logical teaching on natural science?
Yes, the question is, Father Yaki, famous for talking about the importance of the doctrine of creation for the development of Western science, a contingent universe, therefore the only way to know the universe is to go out and observe it, and so forth and so on. And that science before the doctrine of creation is, as he famously says, stillborn, and so forth. I think he's fundamentally wrong. And Thomas Aquinas would think he's wrong, that creation is, and your word was unique. Certainly the doctrine of creation contributes to what was already a developing natural sciences. Modern science begins with Aristotle, right? And the Greeks in general. but primarily Aristotle. The doctrine of creation encourages experimental science, but it doesn't initiate. Aristotle was a great experimental scientist. So I think that the emphasis upon the doctrine of creation as being the key for our understanding how come science develops in the West, I think that overstates the role of creation. Furthermore, I remember talking to him about this at one conference. Thomas Aquinas attributes the doctrine of creation to Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas thinks that Aristotle demonstrates that the world is created. The argument Thomas offers for a metaphysical account of creation is, according to Aquinas, an Aristotelian argument. Now, whether or not Thomas is correct in what he attributes to Aristotle is an important question, and many Aristotelian scholars would deny Thomas's analysis. But Thomas thinks that the principles of metaphysics, which he gets from Aristotle and also from Plato, theories of participation and so forth, are sufficient to demonstrate that what all that is created by God. That we don't have in Aristotle and Plato explicit sentences that say this. Thomas would say they were not so interested in exploring that question. It is Judaism and Christianity, and to some degree Islam, which gives a revelation about creation, which encourages people like Thomas Aquinas to think about the philosophical arguments for what is believed, and how far the philosophical arguments can go, and how far they cannot go. And I tried to suggest that Thomas's distinction between a philosophical analysis of creation, which he thinks, there are 13 times in his writings in which he attributes it to Aristotle. And he says, for example, even though Aristotle thought it was demonstrably true that the world is eternal, when Thomas Aquinas comes to comment on Aristotle's physics, he comes across Aristotle's arguments for the demonstrations for the eternity of the world, and he stops. He says, no, Aristotle makes a mistake here in saying that for sure the world is eternal, because among other things, Thomas believes that the world is not eternal. But he said the arguments for the eternity in the world are not conclusive. And then he stops. He says, the error Aristotle makes is to think that the world is eternal. He does not make the error of thinking that the world is not created. So I think that Father Yaki puts too great an emphasis upon the doctrine of creation as the key for understanding modern science. And one reason is, and this is a comment related to a lot of other thinkers as well, if you think creation is fundamentally a notion of contingency, a contingent, non-necessary universe, and therefore, since the universe is contingent, it is created, Thomas Aquinas does not think that contingency is the key, what it means to be created. He talks about in terms of actuality and potentiality, of essence and existence, not of contingency. And there's a tendency to think that things are contingent, that they happen to be, that they're not necessary. Therefore, they are created. Thus, if you introduce the notion of contingency, you've introduced the notion of creation. But that, Thomas thinks, to argue for creation as being fundamentally a notion of contingency misunderstands the root metaphysical sense of what it means to be created. Metaphysical dependence. Okay. All right. Someone else had a question back there? Yeah? Well, yeah, cause is the tradition. And of course, that's an Aristotelian argument. And see, what Thomas does is he takes Aristotle's notion of motion in the physics for the existence of an unmoved mover, and he broadens the analysis to being, beyond, not just motion, to being, and then concludes that there must be an uncaused cause of being itself. But, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I just wanted to know how.
The question is how to link the notion of an uncaused cause, a philosophical notion, to various religious traditions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity. Well, for Thomas, there is a complementarity between reason, as deployed in all areas, including philosophy, and faith. And Thomas certainly believes that Scripture reveals that all that is created. He says somewhere in the Summa that the opening of Genesis reveals the fact of creation, not the manner or mode of way things come to be. Interesting. That the story in Genesis reveals fundamentally the fact of creation. But the notion, I worked often with Father James Weishaupt of the University of Toronto, and who was deceased quite some time ago, and we wrote a book on philosophy and the God of Abraham. Right? Is the God of philosophers the same as the God of Abraham? And this is a question for Muslims. Is the God of the philosophers the God of the Quran? For Jews, is the God of the philosophers the God of the Hebrew Bible? And for Christians as well. It's less specifically an issue for Hinduism or Buddhism, whatever. And so, does Thomas affirm two creators, a creator in philosophy and a creator in theology? Right? From a point of view of reason alone, one does not know that the God of the philosophers is the God of the Bible. But on the basis of faith, one knows that the God of the Bible and the God of the philosophers are one. Without faith, you cannot conclude that the uncaused cause is the God revealed in Scripture. Right? Because to accept the truths of Scripture already involves having faith. So, and this would be connected as well to Thomas's notion that faith, and in this case revelation, perfects what reason tells us. It doesn't get rid of the uncaused cause. So the theology of creation incorporates all that philosophy says about in metaphysics and adds much, much more. Not only that the world is temporally finite, but that the act of creation understood in Trinitarian Christianity, that the relations of the persons of the Trinity within is reflected without in the causing of the existence of things and so forth. There's a rich theological notion of creation. But if I'm going to talk to audiences who are not Christian, I mean, I can say, don't you see there's some connection here between Trinitarian theology and these notions? But to help audiences see the intelligibility of what is believed, I use philosophical analysis. And not only does the philosophical analysis help us to see the intelligibility of what is believed, but the philosophical analysis provides some truths as well about, in this case, that there is an uncaused cause of all that is. Now, in my talk today, I wasn't concerned about a systematic exposition of the metaphysics of creation as Thomas. I just alluded to it. Because even if you don't think that Thomas is right when he says that reason demonstrates that there's creation, even if you think metaphysics is a bunch of word games, is a set of word games, even if you reject all this, you can understand that the concept of creation Thomas sets forth is not affected at all by what the natural sciences tell us. So that if you think that the natural sciences deny creation, they don't deny creation as Thomas understands creation, which is the orthodox understanding of creation. Now, you might want to reject Thomas Aquinas altogether. Okay, but if you say, what do the natural sciences tell us about creation? It's like the problem of square circle again. We have to, what is the traditional notion of creation? And what is the appropriate competence of the natural sciences? And don't you see, natural scientists or philosophers, that once you understand what Thomas sets forth, even if you don't accept it as conclusive, but once you understand what he sets forth, you cannot argue that the natural sciences deny that. To attack Thomas's position, you have to enter his arena, or deny that his arena doesn't exist or something, and then we can argue about whether the arena of metaphysics exists, and then we can argue even if it does exist, do the arguments Thomas sets forth make sense? But here I was not trying to enter into that. I was sort of showing you that there is this arena to enter, and Thomas makes these points. But the error here is to think that cosmology tells us anything about this arena. And once you make that error, you've got lots of other problems. Can we have one more? Please.
Some of us here spend a lot of time on
Well, the question is about Bernard Lonergan and books such as Insight and so forth. I don't know enough about, Bernard Lonergan is a great scholar of Thomas and also a great scholar of trying to incorporate Thomas into more contemporary philosophical traditions. But I don't know enough to say anything intelligibly about Lonergan on this particular point.
So, I think you correctly
though. Has God causes everything about me. Everything. Now, how could that? God causes your free choice to be your free choice. Otherwise, it would not be. If you think that God's causality functions on the same level as our causality, you've got problems. God is the complete cause of, I'm going to raise my hand, God is the complete cause and I am the complete cause. How can that be? Because the word cause has many different senses. God's causality functions at a fundamentally different level than any kind of causality which occurs within the world. So the causality which occurs in the world is the complete cause of the things which that causality produces. Perhaps look at it this way. We might say in the world, this is an inadequate analysis because of speaking about God. We could talk about a kind of horizontal plane of cause and effects, all sorts of cause and effects, from even if the world is eternal, all going on, including all the causes and effects which I exercise. All of that. And the natural sciences and anthropology study that world of cause and effects. There is a horizontal dimension constantly causing everything that is occurring. There's a vertical dimension constantly causing everything which is occurring in the horizontal dimension. God causes causes to be the causes that they are. That's only possible if God is wholly other, and that God's causality is wholly other. When we talk about God as everything we say about God, including God as cause, falls short of who God is. That kid in China was right. How can finite minds grasp an infinite reality? The only way is analogies. We talk about God as cause because we experience cause and effect, and we appropriate those terms. Or we say God is good, or God is omnipotent, or God is all-knowing. When we say God is omnipotent, we don't mean God has all the power. God is other powerful. He's not all powerful in the sense of all the things we can do. This involves an understanding of God's transcendence. And God transcends the world not in the normal sense of transcendence. God is other in another. Things in this, I will try another way, but things in this world differ from one another. I differ from you, I differ from earthworms, I differ from this cup, and all different things have different actions in the world. God differs differently from things. God just doesn't differ. God differs differently. And that kind of negative approach gives us some insights. Everything we say about God falls short of who God is. But we never fall short of saying true things about God. So God is good. It's true. But what it means for God to be good is never fully understood. Because if we were to fully understand it, it wouldn't be God. But this has led any number of people to, famous in the Middle Ages, a fellow like Maimonides, who said we have to be agnostic. We can't say anything about God. But Thomas Aquinas doesn't. He thinks we can say things even though they all fall short. So, okay.
Thank you. Yes, that's very kind. At the back of the handout, you'll see Dr. Carroll's email. If you have any other questions, he's very generously offered to remain in contact. Why don't we close with prayer? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Go in peace.